Friends, Friedrich Nietzsche was a German philosopher who lived in the second half of the 19th century. His dates are 1844 to 1900. I want to say a little bit about his biography and his life and times, and I'm going to use that as a framing mechanism for understanding some of his philosophical contributions. Nietzsche was a philologist primarily. Okay, let me write that on the board for you. He was not primarily a philosopher. Philology is the study of the origins of languages, what the connections between and among different linguistic groups might happen to be. J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of Lord of the Rings, was a philologist. And actually, the whole Lord of the Rings story is developed out of Tolkien wanting to create Elvish as a language. Nietzsche was an incredible linguist who knew about 23 languages. And as a university student, he was a very successful, well-studied student who became a professor at the age of 24. Okay, because he was so brilliant. Nietzsche, unfortunately, was not a success in all of his things as a young man, all of his endeavors. For instance, he lost out in a love triangle with a woman named Lou Salome. And she chose the other guy, and at that point, Nietzsche vowed that he was never going to love again. And from that time on, you can actually find in his writing a misogynistic strain. Misogyny is an anti-woman bias. A misogynistic strain where he makes comments like the only true evil element in all of human history is the female element. And similar such things, okay? He says similar sorts of comments. Clearly a man who never got over his lost love. And indeed, he never did love again. Although he had many sexual liaisons and ultimately died of syphilis. Nietzsche was a bit of an iconoclast. In fact, not just a bit, that would be an understatement. He was an iconoclast through and through. He rejected everything in the philosophical tradition because he believed that the whole of the philosophical tradition was a fake story just designed to fool people into thinking that a particular way of thinking or way of approaching life was correct when in fact actually it wasn't. Okay, a couple more biographical comments. Nietzsche was during his lifetime treated as an outcast, so he was stripped of his university position because of his rebel views. And although he was brilliant and came up with many novel thoughts, he was ousted from his university position and spent much of his life actually as an outcast, unable to establish relationships with human beings, just living by himself, thinking and writing about the world. Okay, and I wish I could say that he lived a happy life, but he did not live a happy life at all. He was deeply unhappy throughout his life, although he had incredibly keen insights, and I'm going to share some of those insights today. Still, it didn't end well for him. As the story goes, he was in his home one day in 1890 and looked out the window at his writing desk where he would spend his days writing his books, and he saw a cabbie beating his horse. Okay, back then, of course, this was prior to cars, and cabs were drawn by horses. And something in Nietzsche snapped, and he ran outside, and he threw his arms around the neck of the horse, begging the cabbie not to beat the horse. And they led him off, and he was singing at the top of his lungs as they led Nietzsche away. And they took him to an asylum where he spent the last 10 years of his life in madness and despair. Ultimately, he became a very famous thinker, very famous writer. I would say probably the most influential thinker of the modern era. But he didn't know any of that because he actually spent his life, or the end of his life, in an asylum, unaware of the fame that his writings were bringing him. Okay, ultimately he died of syphilis in 1900, but his legacy lives on, and we're going to talk today about some of the reasons why Nietzsche was so famous and became so influential as a thinker. There's not much else to say about his personal life. He was a lifelong bachelor. He doesn't seem to have been able, as I mentioned, to form meaningful human relationships. He didn't really have any attachments. Starting really in his early 20s, he became a kind of a misanthrope. But he stood back from life and he observed it. And he thought about modern life and he thought about the history of the philosophical tradition. And he came up with ideas that were incredibly innovative, different than anybody else was thinking. And for that reason, he is justly famous. And although I disagree with just about everything in Nietzsche's worldview, I basically don't agree with him on almost anything. Still, it is important to be charitable as we approach Nietzsche because he has legitimate bases for saying what he says. And we should be charitable to him on that basis. Okay, and also because his influence has been so widespread and so incredibly developed across different cultures that he bears listening to. Before we actually look at what his philosophy is, are there any questions or comments about his life and times? Yes, Kendrick.
Do you know where he died?
Yes, he died, I believe, in Basel, but don't quote me on that. Basel is in Switzerland. But yeah, put an asterisk beside that because I know that's where he spent most of his last days, but I'm not sure if that is exactly the asylum where he died. Okay, other questions? Let's go ahead and start looking at his thought. Okay, and at the start of today's lecture, I'm going to be focusing mostly on the beginning of the Twilight of the Idols. Okay, the maxims and arrows section, and then the Problem of Socrates section. We'll go to the Problem of Socrates section first. And if we have time, we'll move on to the Reason and Philosophy section. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with the Problem of Socrates. By the way, before we dig into this, I need to say that as you read Nietzsche, it's not going to read like Hume at all. Hume is a careful, cautious, meticulous thinker who's constantly thinking about qualifications and potential objections. But Nietzsche doesn't write that way at all. Nietzsche just throws out ideas and then moves on without defending them or asserting why they are correct. A lot of his writing takes the form of aphorisms. An aphorism is just a little saying. Some sort of little nugget that has a poetic ring and an interesting thought. And that aphoristic approach is actually intentional on Nietzsche's part, because it is an expression of the way of doing and thinking about life that he himself took, and we'll see why momentarily. Okay, so if you get frustrated reading Nietzsche, do know that actually a lot of people don't even consider this to be philosophy, because it doesn't take the form of careful, studied argumentation that includes objections and deals with counterexamples and so forth. it takes the form of, a lot of it at least, aphorisms and temporary kinds of assertions. Okay, but Nietzsche is usually taught in philosophy courses because it's hard to classify him, but the literature people don't want him in their classes, so we teach him in philosophy. Okay, the problem of Socrates is one of Nietzsche's key critiques of the whole tradition. Okay, and basically Nietzsche looked back at the philosophical tradition and he said it was all a mistake. Everything you have read from the tradition, all the thinkers we've encountered this semester, it's all been a mistake. We got onto the wrong path from the beginning. Now, back at the beginning of the semester, we encountered a dude named Socrates. Socrates is kind of the founder of Western philosophy. And if you remember, Socrates was an Athenian who went around asking difficult questions. He would ask questions of his fellow Athenians like, what is truth? What is virtue? Is the soul immortal? How can I know that what I am doing is right? And these questions made his fellow Athenians very uncomfortable. They didn't like it when Socrates questioned them because this undermined their positions of power and finance and status. And so they ultimately put Socrates on trial and convicted him and executed him. Okay, we read about that at the start of the semester. Or at least that's how the tradition has depicted Socrates. Nietzsche says that's not what Socrates was about at all. He's got a completely different take on Socrates. Socrates just pretended to be someone who was interested in truth. He just pretended to be someone who went around asking difficult questions, hoping to find out what the truth is about life or about virtue, whether the soul is immortal, what's the truth about the immortality of the soul, and so forth. But that's not actually what Socrates wanted. This was all a facade, according to Nietzsche. This was a kind of a game that Socrates was playing. Socrates really wanted power. That's what he wanted, according to Nietzsche. Power over others. And Socrates was really devious. He was clever. Socrates realized that if he could get inside the minds of others and not just try to control them physically like powerful emperors of this world try to do, but if he could get inside their minds and control them mentally, then he would be really powerful. Because true power is not just external physical coercion, where you tell people where to go and what to do and jail them if they don't, because that just jails the body and doesn't actually impact the soul. True power is controlling the mind. And Socrates, according to Nietzsche, wanted true power. So what he did is he established this elaborate ruse, this game. And the game followed a formula. Okay, and the formula was an attempt to use reason to discern truth. Reason leads to truth in the Socratic system. At the back of Socrates' hard questions about what is virtue and what is the soul and do we have souls and things like that, is an assumption that if we just reason about these topics, if we use our rationality, then we will discern the truth of the matter about such topics. Okay, so reason leads to truth is the Socratic formula. And this is the formula that Nietzsche thinks that Socrates was using to try to play a game that would enable him to control the minds of others. How would it enable him to control the minds of others? Well, it would enable him to set the parameters of their thinking, to shape their thought. and tell them where these parameters, the outward boundaries, lie, beyond which they ought not to go and within which they ought to think and to develop ideas. Take the word truth, the concept, truth, and the word that reflects that concept. What is implied by that? What is the implication of the word truth? Suppose I say to you, there is a truth to be found here. We're talking about some subject or other. And I say to you, there's a truth to be found here. What is implied by that statement? It's the implicit idea present in that. Yeah, Kendra.
There's a hidden meaning, or there's a goal that we're trying to achieve.
There's a goal we're trying to achieve? Yeah, that's right. Maybe implicit in that statement, there's a truth to be found here, is the idea that there is a right answer to the matter that we're investigating. And by implication, there's a wrong answer as well, or many wrong answers maybe. But there's a right answer and a wrong answer is implied by that. To say that there's truth means that you are assuming that there are rights and wrongs. There are right answers and wrong answers to the question, what is virtue? Or to the question, do you have a soul? There's a right answer and a wrong answer. Okay, and Socrates didn't want people to see that he was up to this mind control game. He didn't want people to see that he was seeking power. And so he disguised his activities in the facade of a language of truth to make his conversational interlocutors think that he, like them, was simply a humble seeker of truth. He, Socrates, was just like them, alongside them, just one man alongside others trying to find the truth about the world. But notice that to say that there is a truth to be found is already to set up a certain set of boundaries about the inquiry in question. It is already to set up a whole laundry list of assumptions about the inquiry in question. Assumptions that he, Socrates, could control or could shape. Okay, and ultimately, what Nietzsche thinks happened is that Socrates won. Socrates may have died personally, but Socrates was incredibly successful as a mind controller. Successful down through the centuries. He won. He convinced everyone. He dominated the tradition. No person towers over the tradition like Socrates. Because Socrates convinced everybody in the tradition for centuries, for millennia after him, that there is truth and there is falsehood. And we human beings should seek the truth and should avoid the falsehood. There's right and there's wrong, and we should seek the right answer to our questions, and we can use reason to discern the right answer to our questions. And we should avoid wrong answers, and we can use reason to avoid those wrong answers. But what if there's no such thing as truth? What if there's no such thing as a true answer to the question, do you have a soul? Or to the question, can virtue be taught? Remember that famous second question of the Meno. If there's no such thing as truth, what if there's no right answer to any of the deep philosophical questions? Like the question, does God exist? What if there's no right answer to that? And by implication, what if there are no wrong answers either? What if there's no such thing as truth? There are just different viewpoints. No one viewpoint is right. No one viewpoint is wrong. They're just different viewpoints. Nietzsche was an advocate of something called perspectivalism. Perspectivalism is just a way of approaching life that says, look, there's no one point of view that's correct. No one religious point of view that's correct, or one view of the soul or of ethics that is correct. No one view of metaphysics or of aesthetics that's correct. Rather, they're just different views. They're different perspectives. He's a perspectivalist. He thinks that actually the Socratic assumption that we can use reason to identify truth fits us into a kind of a game. And within that game, the rules are you have to assume, in order to play the game, you have to assume that there's a truth to be found. Okay, and all the philosophers that we've covered this semester so far have all been assuming that there is a truth to be found. Aristotle, we talked about his views on human happiness, and he assumed that there was a truth to be found when it comes to how to find happiness and live a happy life. And that truth includes being virtuous. Augustine thinks that there's a truth to be found about God's nature and about human sinfulness and about the rescue plan that God has offered us to help us out of our sinful condition. Aquinas assumes there's a truth to be found when it comes to demonstrating God's existence. Okay, or when it comes to separating rights from wrongs in the human law. Descartes assumes there is a truth to be found when it comes to trusting his senses and believing that the world that he perceives outside of himself is the way he thinks it is. Hume thinks that there is a truth to be found when it comes to the question of whether cause and effect, the cause and effect relationship is something that is in our minds only or whether it is in the world itself. All of these thinkers have all been working within the parameters laid out by Socrates, all assuming that there is truth and that we can use reason to achieve that truth. Nietzsche says they've all been playing the Socratic game. They have been Socrates' minions. They have all followed Socrates and been controlled by him. Let me stop for questions. Friedrich.
Not much of a question, but it's more of commentary, but that's fine. Doesn't he also fall into that loophole just a bit? Because for him, the truth is that there is no truth. Wouldn't that...
That's a great question.
Go against himself?
That's a great question. I want to address that question. It is a question that lies at the heart of any relativist worldview. Namely, the relativist is asserting something that's not relative, that it's all relative. That's a great question. I will try to address that question. I want to set out a few more things about Nietzsche, but I will try to address that question before we finish this module on Nietzsche. Thank you. Good. Other questions? So Nietzsche says then that Socrates duped the whole tradition into playing a Socratic game, a game where we use reason to identify truth, and this enabled Socrates to gain power, even in death, over all the philosophers down through the centuries, down through the millennia. We're all Socrates' minions. So how can we step outside of that? How can we step outside of the Socratic game so that we aren't subject to the tyranny of Socrates' thoughts. Let me read a little bit from the text. This is from Twilight of the Idols, the section, The Problem of Socrates. I'm going to be reading bits and pieces from paragraphs 7, 9, and 10. Socrates, Nietzsche says, understood that all the world had need of him, his expedient, his cure, his personal art of self-preservation. Everywhere the instincts were in anarchy, everywhere people were but 5 steps from excess. Instincts want to play the tyrant, we must devise a counter-tyrant who is stronger, Nietzsche writes. And that counter-tyrant was, of course, reason. Reason would corral the instincts. Reason would control everyone. And now I'm reading in section 10, if one needs to make a tyrant of reason as Socrates did, then there must exist no little danger of something else playing the tyrant. Socrates seemed to be a physician, a savior, to save us from our errors. But Socrates was a misunderstanding. The entire morality of improvement, of reason, has been a misunderstanding. Socrates was a form of decadence, a man who pretended to offer us hope, but in fact did not. So what is the problem of Socrates? Why does Nietzsche title this section The Problem of Socrates? I'll tell you what the problem of Socrates was. Socrates was ugly. That was his problem. Socrates was ugly. That's what Nietzsche says. Socrates was ugly. That was his problem. No one's writing this down. You guys write this down. Socrates was ugly. Notice that Nietzsche's criticism of Socrates, the problem of Socrates, is not that Socrates was wrong. Nietzsche doesn't say that. To say that Socrates was wrong is to play the Socratic game. To say that Socrates was wrong is actually to operate within the parameters of right and wrong that Socrates laid out when he told us long ago that we could use reason to discern truth about the world and ourselves. So Nietzsche cannot criticize Socrates and say he was wrong. Nietzsche wants to find some way outside of those ways of thinking entirely, some way to get around the parameters of right and wrong that human beings for millennia have used to frame our thought about the world, about each other, and about ourselves. So when Nietzsche says Socrates was ugly, he is trying to find a way to criticize Socrates without asserting that Socrates was wrong. And to say that Socrates is ugly is a personal attack. Socrates felt himself to be inferior because he was ugly. And so he devised some mechanism, this game of reason, to try to convince others to look elsewhere than at his ugliness, to find some way to control their minds without having them view him as inferior to themselves. Kendrick.
Wait, is that actually in the book?
Yeah, he says Socrates is ugly.
I really wanted to try and listen to him, but the second you said that Socrates is ugly, that was his argument. It's like, just went into the garbage can.
No, that's his criticism. Think about it from Nietzsche's perspective, right? So suppose you want to say that the whole of the tradition is wrong, well, not wrong, the whole of the tradition is a mistake, right? You want to get outside of these ways of thinking, reason, right, wrong. You want to step outside of this entirely. Well, what do you have left?
Irrationality, but that just makes your argument not really, like, I see what he's trying to do by calling Socrates
He's trying to fish around and find a way of thinking that is different than basically everybody has thought for the last 2,500 years prior to him. And it's hard to do that because, right, we're dependent on the minds of predecessors, and the ways of thinking that our ancestors have established are hard to break free of. Nietzsche's trying to break free. He's trying to fish around and see if he can find a way of thinking that doesn't assume right and wrong, and so he doesn't say Socrates was wrong. Does that help a little bit?
But doesn't he also, doesn't that go against his own thing too? So if his way of saying that Socrates is wrong is by saying he's ugly, isn't he still...
He's not saying Socrates is wrong.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But isn't he kind of, isn't that his goal? So he's...
No.
No?
No, he doesn't want to say Socrates is wrong.
Okay.
He doesn't want to say that there is a right way to do philosophy and a wrong way to do philosophy. They're just different ways. It's hard to think this way, isn't it, man? It is for me too. Okay, and again, let's be charitable. Like, this is about as different from my worldview as you can get, but it's very influential. Like, all those people out in society, even among us, we think these ways too because we've been influenced by Nietzsche. Everybody who ever says there's no right or wrong, there are just different points of view. Okay? Here's my way of doing things and your way of doing things, and who's to judge between us? Because we each think that we're right in our own eyes. Right? Everybody who's ever said that is following in Nietzsche's steps. These are Nietzschean thoughts that come from Nietzsche. Nietzsche is incredibly influential. Everyone who has ever espoused relativistic views of cultures or of ethics or of philosophy or of religion is espousing Nietzschean thoughts. Anyone who's ever said, look, no one culture is superior to another. They're just different cultures, different ways of doing things, different perspectives. These are Nietzschean thoughts. This comes right out of Nietzsche. Nietzsche's attempt to get around the whole right and wrong approach to life entirely and to say there is no such thing as truth, there are just truths. Each has a truth that is true for himself. If it works for you, then go, do it. If it works for me, I will do what I want to do. And so forth. Okay? Yeah.
Can I ask another question?
Sure.
So with how he argued previously that Socrates was trying to control people and manipulate people mentally, how do we know that Nietzsche's not trying to do the same thing with his own views?
He is. Yes, he is. And he freely admits that he is. Each one of us is. That's ultimately what we're all doing. Yeah, and we're going to talk about this particular topic at greater length in the course of our module. But let me just say for now that Nietzsche has a concept called the will to power. Very well-known Nietzschean concept. And at the end of the day, there is no truth, there's no right, there's no wrong, there's just power. Each one of us wants power. All human beings want power. And so what we do as human beings is we will disguise our views in the language and the concepts of truth to try to convince each other that there's some objectively right way of doing life or of thinking about things. But really, it's a game. It's all a game. Because each one of us at the end of the day just wants power. That's all we want. That's all that we have. Socrates wanted power. I want power. You want power. The winners in life are the ones who gain power over others. When people go into the public square and they make arguments to each other to try to convince each other of the correctness of their positions, what they are doing is they are playing a game of power where they disguise their true intentions in a language that is intended to deceive others about what they are actually hoping to accomplish. So, for instance, let me just do a Nietzschean analysis of a contemporary social movement. This is probably going to be incredibly controversial, but this is what Nietzsche would say. This is not what I would say. Okay, this last summer, during the lockdowns, there were widespread social protests all over America over the George Floyd killing. Okay, and just this last week, the jury handed down a verdict and convicted Derek Chauvin of murder in this case. Okay. Now, the widespread social protests were largely because people felt that there is racial injustice in America. Okay, and this racial injustice is manifested in the institutional system, in the legal system, which is biased against minorities, especially African Americans. Okay, that's the criticism. And so a lot of the protesters were arguing that we need to have justice. We need to have justice. We need to establish a society in which we don't have these systemic racial biases and forms of discrimination and prejudice that keep certain groups down, that harm them, that ultimately lead to the deaths of some of them, but that at the very least lead to less prosperity for them, less happiness, less success in life. Okay, we need justice. We need a system that is more just. Okay, here's what Nietzsche would say about all that. All those protesters arguing for justice, agitating for justice, and saying that there's a better way to live and to set society up, a way that is more just. You're playing this game, saying there's a better right as opposed to a wrong. There is a way of setting society up that is more just, as opposed to what we've got now, which is less just. What they really want, Nietzsche would say, is they want power. They want power over their fellow citizens. And they're using this language of justice and equality. These concepts, facade concepts of equality before the law. Some of them want affirmative action. Affirmative action, a system where special privileges are given to minorities to advance them in life. Okay, with the ostensible reason being that this rights a wrong, a historical wrong, the injustice built into the system against minorities. So we need affirmative action to make this right. Nietzsche would say what they really want is power. They want ascendancy in the society. They want control over their fellow citizens. And they're using the language of justice as a kind of a Trojan horse to sneak into the walls of the citadel and to gain power for themselves over others. Okay, and I could do a Nietzschean analysis of a bunch of different social movements or ideas, but basically Nietzsche says that whenever you hear the language of truth and falsehood or right and wrong, what's going on is people are trying to deceive each other into giving themselves more power. Socrates' problem is not that he wanted power. He did, according to Nietzsche. We all want power. Socrates' problem is that he was ugly. He was ugly. Now, this is hard to understand, this ugly criticism. What's wrong with being ugly? Right? Is it a mistake? Well, Nietzsche is operating on a kind of 19th century mindset here. He says the physiognomy on Socrates' face was ugly. Because Socrates went about his approach to power in a deceptive way. He sought to deceive others into thinking that he, like them, was just a fellow traveler seeking truth. Instead of a straightforward, forthright seizure of power, Socrates developed a devious, out of the ordinary, out of the way, roundabout approach to power. That's the problem. It's not honorable. It's not honorable. Nietzsche's looking for a way of thinking about human beings and about human life and about philosophy that precedes Socratic categories. And if you go back in Western culture prior to Socrates, you encounter these warrior cultures where systems of honor and shame dominate. They are cultures that precede right and wrong as the dominant ways of thinking. They're cultures that precede truth and falsehood, or justice and injustice, or equality and inequality, liberty and coercion as dominant ways of thinking. And Nietzsche thinks that in order to get around the Socratic game and to return to a more constructive, not a right way of thinking about the world, but a more constructive way of thinking about the world, we need to return to pre-Socratic cultures, pre-Socratic ways of thinking. And Socrates was ugly, and this ugliness was actually a manifestation, an external manifestation of his deceptive approach to power. So rather than a straightforward, forthright seizure of power, Socrates sought to go roundabout and to deceive others. This is ultimately why Nietzsche dislikes women. Women want power too. But you know what? They're not physically stronger, so they deceive. They come up with a roundabout way to sink their claws into others. They seduce rather than coerce. And this is not honorable, according to Nietzsche. Again, not my worldview, but a very influential view. Okay, a view that has led to the relativism in our culture today. Every time you encounter cultural relativism or ethical relativism or any form of relativism, it actually comes right out of Nietzsche. So it's a very, very influential perspective. Okay, let me pause for questions or comments before I say a couple last things. Kendrick.
A little off topic, but by any chance, did that girl he had feelings for, was she pro Socrates?
I'm not sure if Lou Salome was pro-Socrates or not. I will say this about Lou Salome. I think she made a good choice in choosing the other guy. She probably was pretty wise in actually choosing not to go with Nietzsche. Okay, but, I mean, there's been this extraordinary... So, again, whether or not you agree with this critique, it is a very original critique of Western thought. It's really, like, nobody, I wouldn't have thought of this. Nobody else was thinking along these lines. And Western thought has taken a really different turn because Nietzsche. And because of Nietzsche's criticisms, which were so novel, he basically came up with a way of thinking about the whole tradition that everybody else had neglected. Let me read the section on reason in philosophy. Okay? So, the Problem of Socrates, and then he's got a section on reason in philosophy. By the way, we're focusing mostly today on Nietzsche's criticisms of the Greeks and of Socratic way of thinking. But that was only one of the two great mistakes that Western culture made, according to Nietzsche. The other great mistake of Western culture was Christianity. Okay? The Judeo-Christian worldview, belief in a monotheistic God, belief that human beings are sinful and can be saved. This was all a mistake as well. We're going to get into Nietzsche's criticisms of Christianity, but I want to make it clear that in rejecting the tradition, he's not just rejecting Greek thought. He actually thinks there are two sources of Western thought, Athens and Jerusalem. And he wants to reject both of them as both being deeply pernicious and damaging. Okay, we'll get into the second half of the criticism in the course of the module. But if you look at the reason in philosophy section, he talks here extensively about the ways in which this notion of reason has been used to shape our thinking and has oriented us into a way of of approaching the world that just boxes us in. Okay, it keeps us from being able to be creative or to explore the world. Okay, and so for instance, Nietzsche goes into these long, extensive passages praising the senses, okay, the immediate senses, which are a way of thinking and approaching the world that isn't subject to the categories of right and wrong. It's just immediate sensory perceptions. Okay, he's a sensualist. He thinks that we need to indulge in our senses, and especially in our sensorial appetites, because they're not subject to the categories of right and wrong. Okay, we'll get into more of that a little bit later, but essentially for now, for the purposes of what I'm about to read, all you need to know is that Nietzsche thinks that if you feel an urge to a sexual desire urge, you should indulge it. Or if you feel an urge to eat or to sleep, indulge your appetite for gluttony or indulge your appetite for sleep. Because to say that it's wrong to follow these desires is to play the Socratic game of right and wrong. So Nietzsche goes into these extensive passages talking about the senses. He says, what subtle instruments for observation we possess in our senses. This nose of mine, for example, of which no philosopher has hitherto spoken with respect and gratitude, so his nose has not been respected, is nonetheless the most delicate tool at my command. It can detect minimal differences in movement which even the spectroscope cannot detect. Okay, the rest of the tradition in approaching my nose in this manner has been an abortion and not a true science, which is to say all of metaphysics, theology, psychology, and epistemology has not appreciated my nose. Okay, so there are extensive passages that read like this. Okay, and obviously there's a kind of a satirical element to this, right? You know, it seems kind of absurd that this guy would go on and on about his nose. But it's an attempt to think about life that gets away from the categories of right and wrong. So for instance, I'll leave you with this. He's got another famous passage where he talks about descending into the basement of Christian morality to see what he's going to find there. And some people would say this is actually literature, not really philosophy. So he writes about how he went down into the basement of Christian morality to see what he could see there. And he brought a lantern with him. And he started to look around, and all he could see was the rats. All he could see was the sewer water. And then the smell overpowered him. And he had to rush back up the stairs because the stench was so overwhelming that he could not think, he could not concentrate, because Christian morality was so toxic. Okay, so that's a kind of an approach that criticizes the received morality of the tradition without saying that it's right or wrong. Instead, it's toxic to the senses. Okay? It's a way of getting around right and wrong or truth and falsehood as ways of thinking. Okay, any wrap-up questions on the day?